He mocked the black judge, arrogant and full of racism, thinking he was untouchable. But when the judge revealed a truth no one saw coming, his smug smile disappeared instantly. What happened next left the entire courtroom in shock. The courtroom hummed with tension, a heavy air of anticipation settling over the spectators like an invisible weight. The polished mahogany walls bore witness to countless trials, but today something felt different. The air crackled, as if the universe itself held its breath, waiting for what was to come. At the defense table sat attorney Richard Langston, his custom-tailored Armani suit draping effortlessly over his broad shoulders. A man in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair slicked back, and an ego that could barely be contained within the courtroom's high ceilings. He exuded the smug confidence of a man who had won more cases than he cared to count, who believed the world bent to his will because, until now, it always had. Langston leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks as the bailiff cleared his throat. He cast a lazy glance around the courtroom, his smirk widening as he spotted the judge's empty seat. "The Honourable Judge Mattis running late? How typical," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. A few chuckles rippled through the defense side of the room. Associates, clerks, even a few spectators who recognized Langston's reputation for arrogance. Assistant District Attorney Sandra Phillips, seated across from him, shot him a glare, but said nothing. She had long learned that men like Langston thrived on reaction, feeding off the discomfort of those they belittled. But today she had a feeling that silence would be his undoing. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The bailiff immediately straightened, his voice echoing through the chamber. "All rise. Court is now in session. The Honourable Judge Michael Harrington presiding." The room collectively stood as a man in a black robe entered, his presence commanding but quiet. Judge Harrington strode toward the bench with a measured step, placing a few files on the desk, before finally settling into his chair. Only then did he glance up, his deep brown eyes sweeping the room. Langston's smirk twitched as he got his first proper look at the judge. A black man. He scoffed softly under his breath, shaking his head as he took his seat. The noise wasn't loud, but in the silent reverence of the courtroom, it was deafening. Judge Harrington's gaze settled on him. There was no immediate reaction, no flare of anger, no furrow of offense. Instead, a long, quiet stare, one that spoke of patience, of experience, of having seen this brand of arrogance before and knowing exactly how to handle it. Langston, oblivious to the quiet shift in energy, leaned forward, tapping his pen against the desk. "Let's move this along, shall we, Your Honor? Some of us have real cases to get to." The room held its breath. Judge Harrington tilted his head, his voice steady. "I see. And you are?" Langston blinked. A few of his associates stiffened. The judge continued, tone calm, measured. "I ask because, Mr. Langston, in my court, respect is not optional, and so far, you've shown none." A few murmurs scattered across the gallery. Ada Phillips sat a little straighter, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Langston, for the first time in years, hesitated. Judge Harrington flipped open a file. "Before we proceed, I believe a lesson in humility is in order, Mr. Langston. One you are long overdue to learn." Langston's smirk disappeared. The room, now completely silent, waited. And then the judge spoke. The trial commenced, but Langston found it increasingly difficult to focus. His usual poise, his air of control, it was slipping, and the worst part was that he knew it. Judge Harrington wasn't just another bureaucratic obstacle to bulldoze over. He was something Langston hadn't encountered in years, an immovable force. The prosecution began their opening statement, delivered with a quiet intensity by Ada Phillips. Langston barely registered her words, his mind too preoccupied with regaining control. He sat rigid in his chair, tapping his pen against the table in a steady rhythm. Finally, his turn arrived. Langston stood, straightened his tie, and approached the jury with practiced ease. A smirk danced on the edge of his lips as he delivered his opening remarks, a performance he had perfected over decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and commanding, "the prosecution will attempt to paint my client as a criminal, but I urge you to see through the theatrics. The facts will reveal that Mr. Langston, Judge Harrington's voice cut through his statement like a blade. Langston froze mid-stride, his composure flickering. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's eyes bore into him. "Save the dramatics. Stick to the facts." A ripple of murmurs flowed through the courtroom. The smirk slid from Langston's face, replaced with something dangerously close to irritation. He clenched his jaw but nodded. "Of course, Your Honor," he said through gritted teeth before turning back to the jury. "As I was saying, the facts will reveal that my client is not guilty of the crime he's been accused of. The prosecution's case is built on circumstantial evidence, and when we examine it closely, I have no doubt you will find reasonable doubt." Judge Harrington remained silent, his expression unreadable, but Langston could feel the man's presence pressing down on him, scrutinizing his every word, his every move. It wasn't just oversight, it was a challenge, and Langston wasn't sure he was winning. As he returned to his seat, Ada Phillips leaned slightly toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not used to being on a leash, are you?" Langston shot her a sharp glance but said nothing. His mind was racing too fast, his pulse beating against his throat. This wasn't going to be like any other trial he had fought. Judge Harrington wasn't an opponent he could intimidate, and for the first time in his career, Richard Langston was starting to realize he wasn't in control of this courtroom. Langston's jaw tightened, his usual air of invincibility flickering for the briefest moment. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat as he adjusted his tie. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of the judge's gaze pressing down on him like an anvil. Judge Harrington tapped his pen against the desk, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "Mr. Langston, I suggest you tread carefully. Arrogance might have won you favors elsewhere, but in my courtroom, the law reigns supreme." A hush settled over the gallery. Langston had spent his entire career commanding rooms, turning court proceedings into mere formalities, but something about this judge unsettled him. Not because he feared the law, no, Langston knew how to bend it to his will, but because for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't in control. "I meant no disrespect, Your Honor," Langston said, his voice smooth, though slightly strained. "I simply believe in efficiency. The courts are overburdened enough without unnecessary delays." Judge Harrington leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "And yet, Mr. Langston, your conduct is what's delaying us now. Interesting, isn't it?" A few quiet chuckles rippled through the spectators. Langston's face darkened. He wasn't used to being made a spectacle of, least of all by a judge he had so clearly underestimated. Ada Phillips watched the exchange with quiet amusement. She had seen Langston bulldoze through lesser judges, throwing his weight around until they yielded. But today, she saw something different. A man forced to confront his own reflection in the polished surface of the law, and it was a sight to behold. Judge Harrington picked up a file and flipped through it, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Mr. Langston, how long have you been practicing law?" Langston straightened, eager to reassert himself. 23 years. The judge nodded. 23 years. That's a long time. Plenty of experience. His gaze lifted, pinning Langston in place. "Tell me, in those 23 years, have you ever found yourself in contempt of court?" A vein pulsed in Langston's temple. "No, Your Honor." Judge Harrington set the file down. "Let's keep it that way." The words landed with the force of a gavel. The message was clear. This was not Langston's courtroom. As the judge motioned for the proceedings to begin, Langston clenched his fists beneath the desk, his mind racing. For the first time in his career, he felt something foreign creeping into his bones. Doubt, and worse, fear. The trial commenced, but Langston found it increasingly difficult to focus. His usual poise, his air of control, it was slipping, and the worst part was that he knew it. Judge Harrington wasn't just another bureaucratic obstacle to bulldoze over. He was something Langston hadn't encountered in years, an immovable force. The prosecution began their opening statement, delivered with a quiet intensity by Ada Phillips. Langston barely registered her words, his mind too preoccupied with regaining control. He sat rigid in his chair, tapping his pen against the table in a steady rhythm. Finally, his turn arrived. Langston stood, straightened his tie, and approached the jury with practiced ease. A smirk danced on the edge of his lips as he delivered his opening remarks. a performance he had perfected over decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and commanding, "the prosecution will attempt to paint my client as a criminal, but I urge you to see through the theatrics. The facts will reveal that—" "Mr. Langston," Judge Harrington's voice cut through his statement like a blade. Langston froze mid-stride, his composure flickering. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's eyes bore into him. "Save the dramatics. Stick to the facts." A ripple of murmurs flowed through the courtroom. The smirk slid from Langston's face, replaced with something dangerously close to irritation. He clenched his jaw, but nodded. "Of course, Your Honor," he said through gritted teeth before turning back to the jury. "As I was saying, the facts will reveal that my client is not guilty of the crime he's been accused of. The prosecution's case is built on circumstantial evidence, and when we examine it closely, I have no doubt you will find reasonable doubt." Judge Harrington remained silent, his expression unreadable, but Langston could feel the man's presence pressing down on him, scrutinizing his every word, his every move. It wasn't just oversight, it was a challenge, and Langston wasn't sure he was winning. As he returned to his seat, Ada Phillips leaned slightly toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not used to being on a leash, are you?" Langston shot her a sharp glance but said nothing. His mind was racing too fast, his pulse beating against his throat. This wasn't going to be like any other trial he had fought. Judge Harrington wasn't an opponent he could intimidate, and for the first time in his career, Richard Langston was starting to realize he wasn't in control of this courtroom. Langston sat at the defense table, gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. He forced himself to exhale, smoothing the crease forming between his brows. This was salvageable. It had to be. Judge Harrington was just another judge, another obstacle. Langston had faced plenty in his career. Judges who thought they could put him in his place, who mistook his confidence for arrogance. But in the end, they all bent, they all yielded. And yet, as the trial moved forward, it became painfully clear that Judge Harrington was not like the others. Every time Langston attempted to lead a witness, the judge shut him down. "Rephrase, Mr. Langston. Stick to the question, counselor. Let's not waste the jury's time." The spectators in the gallery weren't just watching the case anymore, they were watching him. He could feel it. The way they leaned forward, waiting for the next clash. Even his client, a wealthy businessman accused of fraud, was starting to notice. The man leaned toward Langston during a break, his voice low and biting. "You said you had this handled." "I do," Langston shot back, though the words tasted hollow even in his own mouth. Across the aisle, Ada Phillips worked seamlessly, her confidence growing with every exchange. She was playing this case like a game of chess, and Langston, for the first time, felt like he was losing. Then came the moment that shattered whatever was left of his control. Langston called his key witness, an expert accountant who was meant to discredit the prosecution's financial analysis. The man took the stand, adjusting his glasses nervously. Langston rose, smoothing his suit, slipping into his usual commanding presence. This, at least, he could control. "Mr. Dunn," he began, pacing slowly, "can you confirm for the court that the prosecution's financial report contained critical miscalculations?" Dunn cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Well, I wouldn't necessarily call them critical." Langston stiffened. "But there were errors." Dunn hesitated. "Yes, but they were within a margin of—" "Just answer the question," Langston snapped, his patience unraveling. Before Dunn could reply, Judge Harrington leaned forward, his voice cutting through the room. "Mr. Langston." Langston turned sharply. "Your Honor." Harrington's eyes locked onto him, calm but unyielding. "This is the last time I'll warn you. You do not badger witnesses in my courtroom." Langston opened his mouth, but the judge continued, his tone razor-sharp. "Control your temper, counselor, or I will control it for you." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Even the jury shifted uncomfortably. Langston's breath hitched, his pulse pounding in his ears. Control it for me. He had never felt so publicly humiliated. His hands curled into fists beneath the desk as he sat back down, staring straight ahead. For the first time in his career, Richard Langston wasn't just losing. He was being taught a lesson. Langston could feel the heat rising to his face, a slow burn of indignation creeping up his neck. He had spent years carving his reputation into the marble of the legal world, winning cases, commanding courtrooms, controlling the narrative. But here he was, seated like a schoolboy scolded by the principal, while the entire courtroom feasted on his downfall. He took a slow breath, willing his hands to relax. He couldn't lose his composure. Not here, not now. But even as he straightened his tie and masked his frustration behind a thin smile, the cracks in his confidence were starting to show. Across the aisle, Ada Phillips pretended to be focused on her notes, but Langston knew better. He caught the slight quirk of her lips, the glint of amusement in her eyes. She wasn't just winning this case. She was enjoying watching him squirm. The trial moved forward, but Langston's focus splintered. Every objection he made was swiftly overruled. Every attempt to steer the case in his favor was met with resistance. He was playing a game where the rules had changed, and for the first time, he wasn't the one dictating them. Then came the moment that sent his world tilting. During cross-examination, Langston attempted to poke holes in a witness's testimony, a forensic accountant brought in by the prosecution. He needed to dismantle their credibility, twist their words, plant seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. He leaned in slightly, voice smooth but firm. "So, Mr. Patel, you're saying you reviewed the financial statements in their entirety?" "Yes," the man responded without hesitation. Langston smirked. "And yet, you failed to mention a discrepancy in my client's offshore accounts. How do you explain that?" The witness opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Harrington's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Mr. Langston." Langston's patience snapped. He turned, jaw clenched. "Your Honor, Judge Harrington didn't raise his voice, but the sheer weight of his next words dropped like a gavel. "Sit down." The air was sucked from the room. A hush fell over the courtroom, heavy and suffocating. Even Langston's own associates went rigid beside him. He opened his mouth, his ego screaming for a rebuttal, but something in the judge's gaze stopped him cold. It wasn't just authority, it was finality. For the first time in his career, Richard Langston was being put in his place. Slowly, stiffly, he lowered himself back into his chair, his body taut with unspent rage. Judge Harrington let the silence stretch a moment longer before speaking. "This court does not operate under your personal sense of entitlement, Mr. Langston. You will show respect to the witness, to opposing counsel, and to this bench." His voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath it. "I do not repeat myself." Langston sat motionless, his hands clenched beneath the table, his ears burning with humiliation. He had lost control of the room. And worse, he had no idea how to get it back. The weight of the judge's words pressed down on Langston like a lead brick. "Sit down." Two simple words that had unraveled years of unchecked arrogance, slicing through his ego like a scalpel. He sat stiffly, fists clenched beneath the table, his jaw so tight it ached. He could hear the hushed murmurs in the gallery, feel the stares digging into his skin. He was the spectacle now, the once untouchable attorney reduced to a man grasping for control and failing, badly. Ada Phillips didn't even bother hiding her amusement anymore. She sat with perfect posture, tapping her pen against her legal pad, a ghost of a smirk lingering on her lips. Langston forced himself to focus. He could still recover. He had to recover. "Your Honor," he began, his voice measured but strained. "I apologize if my approach was forceful. I simply believe in thorough cross-examination." Judge Harrington stared at him for a moment, unreadable. Then, with maddening composure, he spoke. "I have no issue with thoroughness, Mr. Langston. I do, however, have an issue with arrogance, disguised as professionalism." A few quiet gasps rippled through the room. Langston felt them like daggers to his pride. His ears burned. Arrogance. No one ever dared to speak to him like this in court. Harrington continued, flipping through a file without even looking at Langston. "You seem to think you're the smartest man in this room. That's unfortunate, because the moment a lawyer stops listening, stops respecting the very court he operates in, he ceases to be effective." Langston gritted his teeth. "Your Honor, The judge held up a hand, stopping him cold. "No, you listen now, Mr. Langston." Silence swallowed the courtroom whole. Langston's hands curled into fists beneath the table. His face felt hot, his pulse thundering in his ears. Then Judge Harrington leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady, and with his next words, he detonated Langston's entire world. You stand in this courtroom today, oblivious to the irony of your own ignorance. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Because before I wore this robe, before I sat on this bench, I was a trial attorney just like you. He paused, letting that sink in. And if you weren't so blinded by your own self-importance, Mr. Langston, you might have remembered that I was the one who mentored you. The courtroom gasped. Langston went completely still. It felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. He stared at the judge, his mind frantically scrambling through memories, trying to piece together a truth he had ignored for years. And then, like a sudden blow to the stomach, it hit him. Michael Harrington. The name had lingered in the depths of his past, buried beneath Langston's towering ego. A seasoned attorney, a man who had once guided him when he was fresh out of law school, full of ambition, but blind to his own shortcomings. A man he had dismissed, disregarded. A man he had mocked behind closed doors. Langston's mouth went dry. His heart pounded against his ribcage. Judge Harrington watched him, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back, closing the file in front of him. You don't remember, do you? His voice was softer now, almost pitying. That's the thing about arrogance, Mr. Langston. It erases humility, and with it, you lose sight of the very people who once helped you climb. Langston opened his mouth, but for the first time in his life, he had no words. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. It stretched like an open wound, raw and exposed. Langston sat frozen, his usually sharp mind numb with shock. He had forgotten. He had erased Judge Harrington from his past, the same way he erased anyone he deemed unimportant. And now, that arrogance had come back to devour him whole. His throat was dry. He forced himself to swallow, to steady his breath. But nothing could stop the tidal wave of humiliation that crashed over him. The gallery was watching. The jury was watching. Ada Phillips was watching. And worst of all, Judge Harrington was waiting. Langston knew he had to say something. Anything. His reputation, his career, hell, his dignity, depended on it. He cleared his throat, but when he spoke, his voice lacked its usual smoothness. Your Honor, I meant no disrespect. If I have overlooked certain things in the past, that was never my intention. Judge Harrington's expression remained unreadable, but his next words struck harder than any outburst ever could. I don't need an apology, Mr. Langston. What I need is for you to understand that the legal system does not exist for your personal theatrics. It does not bow to your ego. It is here to serve justice. Langston stiffened. The judge continued, his voice steady but firm. You walked into this courtroom believing yourself untouchable, but today, you've been given a lesson in something far more important than legal strategy. He leaned forward, his deep brown eyes locking onto Langston's like iron. You've been given a lesson in humility. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The words cut deeper than Langston wanted to admit. Judge Harrington exhaled, glancing down at his docket before speaking again. Now, let's move forward, properly. If there is another outburst, another instance of unprofessionalism, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear? Langston's ears burned. He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge raised an eyebrow. Langston clenched his jaw, forcing the words out properly. Yes, Your Honor. Only then did Judge Harrington lean back in his chair. Good. Proceed. Langston sat stiffly in his seat, his entire body rigid with humiliation. He had lost today, not just the case, but something far more devastating, his invincibility. And the worst part, he had no one to blame but himself. The trial moved forward, but for Langston everything blurred into static. His mind, once a sharpened weapon in the courtroom, felt dull and slow. He answered mechanically, presented his arguments without his usual fire, but he knew. It was over. The jury no longer saw a powerful, commanding attorney. They saw a man who had been put in his place, a man stripped of his bravado, his arrogance reduced to nothing but empty echoes of what once was. Judge Harrington remained composed throughout the proceedings, never once gloating, never once reveling in Langston's humiliation. but that made it worse. There was no satisfaction, no final act of revenge, just quiet, unwavering authority. It was the ultimate defeat. As the trial drew to a close, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, their verdict was swift. Guilty. Langston barely reacted. He sat there, hands clasped tightly together, his fingernails digging into his palms. His client shot him a look of pure venom, a man who had paid handsomely for a win, but had received a lesson instead. Judge Harrington delivered the sentence with the same measured tone he had carried throughout the trial. No malice, no satisfaction, just justice. "Mr. Langston," the judge said as the courtroom began to clear. A word. Langston hesitated. Then, slowly, he rose, walking stiffly to the bench like a man heading to the gallows. Judge Harrington studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I was hard on you today." Langston swallowed, forcing himself to meet the judge's gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you needed it." Langston flinched. Judge Harrington leaned forward slightly, voice low but firm. "You can either let this moment define you, or you can learn from it. But I'll tell you one thing, Mr. Langston. You are not the smartest man in the room. And the sooner you accept that, the better lawyer you'll become." Langston clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue. He always argued. But for the first time in his career, he had nothing left to say. Judge Harrington nodded. Court adjourned. Langston turned and walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders. As he stepped into the hallway, the whispers followed him. Not admiration, not respect, just the undeniable truth. Richard Langston, the once untouchable attorney, had been humbled, and the world had watched every second of it.